What if the most romantic night of your life started with a lie and a fear of fishing worms? Tonight, James and Diep are accidentally stranded by the riverbank for a secret event that will change their relationship forever. Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're exploring this unexpected overnight journey and the surprise James has been hiding. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update on their journey. The sun began its slow, heavy descent behind the jagged tree line, bleeding deep hues of crimson and burnt orange across the sky. The river, which had been a bright, sparkling blue all afternoon, was now transformed into a sheet of hammered gold, reflecting the dying light in a way that felt almost melancholic. It was that specific transitional hour where the world seems to hold its breath. The birds go quiet, the wind dies down, and a thick silver mist starts to crawl out from the reeds along the bank. Diep, ever the practical soul, felt the shift in the air. She knew that in this part of the country, once the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. She stood up, her joints a bit stiff from sitting on the damp earth, and began to brush the dry grass and dust from her jeans. She looked toward the narrow, overgrown trail that wound its way back toward DJ Farm. "James, we really should start packing up," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the evening. The light is fading fast, and you know how treacherous that path gets once the fog settles in. I don't fancy tripping over tree roots in the pitch black. She started reaching for the fishing tackle, winding the line with a practiced efficiency, already mentally calculating how long it would take them to get back to the warmth of the farmhouse. But James didn't move. He remained seated on his small folding stool, silhouetted against the fiery sky, looking surprisingly composed for a man who had spent the better part of the morning jumping at the sight of earthworms. There was a playful, knowing smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, the kind of look he usually wore right before a big drop in one of his DJ sets. Instead of reaching for his backpack, he slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of paper. It wasn't a map of the area, but a detailed star chart. He stood up and walked over to her, gently catching her hand to stop her from dismantling the last of the rods. "I've actually been doing a bit of planning, Diep," he said, his voice dropping into that warm, grounded tone that always seemed to catch her off guard and make the world feel a little smaller. "We aren't going back tonight. At least, not yet. I checked the astronomical calendar before we left the farm. Tonight is the absolute peak of the Perseid meteor shower. It's supposed to be the most spectacular celestial show we've seen in years." Diep blinked, looking from the intricate star chart to the darkening horizon, trying to process the sudden shift in plans. James stepped closer, his eyes bright with a mixture of nervous energy and genuine excitement. "Think about it for a second. Back at the farm, or even worse, back in the city, the light pollution ruins everything. You might see a faint streak if you're lucky. But here, with this wide-open horizon and not a single artificial light for miles, we'll be able to see the entire universe laid bare. I didn't want us to just hear about it on the news tomorrow. I wanted us to be right here, under it. Don't you want to make a wish with me under 1,000 stars?" The skepticism on Diep's face slowly melted into a soft, surprised laugh as James led her toward a large, drooping willow tree a few yards away. Tucked neatly behind its curtain of leaves was a small, high-tech pop-up tent, 2 thick sleeping bags, and a rucksack that smelled faintly of sandwiches and coffee. It turned out the entire fishing trip niche had been a carefully constructed ruse for a much more ambitious overnight adventure. However, the romantic tension took a hilarious, much-needed turn for the light-hearted the moment they actually had to set up camp. James, a man who could navigate the most complex digital soundboards and mixing consoles with his eyes closed, was utterly defeated by a set of fiberglass tent poles. Within minutes, he was breaking a sweat, tangled in a mess of nylon and elastic cords. Every time he thought he had the structure secured, the whole thing would groan and collapse in a heap of fabric the moment he let go. He'd mutter something about faulty engineering, while Diep sat on a log clutching her stomach from laughing so hard. "Here, "Let me save you before you end up accidentally camping inside a giant blue pancake," Diep finally said, stepping in to take the lead. They worked together, their hands occasionally brushing as they staked down the corners of the tent into the soft riverbank soil. While the tent finally took its proper shape, James busied himself with the next masculine challenge, the campfire. Even though he was trying his hardest to be the rugged protector for the night, his true nature kept slipping through. Every time a twig snapped in the dark underbrush, or a heavy nocturnal beetle buzzed too close to his ear, he would jump nearly out of his skin, scanning the shadows with a frantic flashlight beam. Diep had to remind him more than once that the local squirrels weren't exactly known for their predatory instincts. Despite his clumsiness and his obvious fear of the pitch-black woods, the sheer effort he was putting in didn't go unnoticed by Diep. As she watched him struggle to balance the stones for the fire pit, she realised this wasn't just about a meteor shower. James was stepping entirely out of his comfort zone, facing his deep-seated aversions to bugs, dirt, and the unpredictable wild, just to create a memory that belonged only to them. It was a gesture of profound, unpolished sincerity. He wasn't trying to impress her with a fancy dinner or a grand, expensive gift. He was giving her his time, his vulnerability, and a total escape from the reality of their daily stresses at the farm. As the first tiny flames finally caught on the dry tinder, casting a flickering amber glow across their faces, the entire atmosphere of the riverbank shifted. The cold, creeping dampness of the night was pushed back by the growing warmth of the fire. They sat down to eat the rest of the rice balls and the fish they had caught earlier, the crackling of the burning wood providing a rhythmic, comforting soundtrack to the deepening night. Diep felt a sense of peace that was different from the one they had found earlier in the afternoon. The temporary nature of this tranquility, the fear she'd confessed earlier about everything being fleeting, seemed to dissipate in the heat of the fire. She looked at James, who was now proudly poking at the embers with a long stick, and realised that his sweet deception was exactly what she needed to believe that some things were worth staying for. The night was just beginning. Above them, the sky had turned a deep, velvety obsidian, and the first few stars were starting to pierce through the darkness like diamonds on a black cloth. The anticipation for the first star to fall began to build between them, a shared secret in the middle of nowhere. They were miles away from their responsibilities, tucked away in a tiny glowing bubble of light and warmth, waiting for the universe to put on its show. As the fire settled into a steady rhythmic hum and the last traces of violet were scrubbed from the sky, a profound velvety obsidian swallowed the riverbank. The world beyond their small circle of amber light ceased to exist, leaving James and Diep in a private sanctuary of heat and shadows. The air grew heavy and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, while a low, ghostly mist began to crawl across the surface of the river. They huddled together under a single thick wool blanket, the kind of closeness that felt both necessary for the cold and deeply intentional. For a long time, neither spoke. They simply listened to the rhythmic gurgle of the water and the occasional sharp pop of a burning log. Then it happened. A sharp, brilliant streak of silver tore through the darkness directly above them, so fast and vivid that Diep gasped, her hand instinctively tightening on James's arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile magic of the moment. James didn't look at the sky. He was looking at her, his face softened by the dancing firelight, watching the reflection of the stars ignited in her pupils. "I saw it," he replied softly, his voice grounded and steady. Soon the trickle of light turned into a flood. Dozens of meteors began to rain down in silent, majestic arcs, carving glowing paths across the heavens. In that moment, the niche of their complicated lives, the endless chores at DJ Farm, the weight of past mistakes, and the uncertainty of their future, seemed to shrink until it was nothing more than a speck of dust in the vastness of the universe. Diep leaned her head on his shoulder, her breath hitching slightly as a fireball larger than the rest illuminated the entire riverbank for a split second. "You know," she murmured, find her voice in the stillness. "This morning I told you I was scared that peace was just a temporary thing. I was so sure it would vanish the second we stepped back into reality tomorrow." James shifted, wrapping his arm more firmly around her, pulling her into the solid warmth of his chest. He looked up at the celestial display, the Perseids' fireballs lighting up the night with an ancient cold fire. "I've been thinking about that all day," he admitted, his honesty cutting through the silence. "But look at those stars, Diep. They've been burning for millions of years before we got here. Even when we can't see them because of the clouds or the bright sun, they're still there. I think we're like that. Peace isn't about the absence of noise or the absence of work. It's about having someone to sit in the quiet with when the world gets too loud." The conversation drifted into deeper, uncharted waters as the night progressed. They talked about things they usually kept tucked away in the corners of their minds. James's hidden anxieties about his fading connection to the city's music scene, and Diep's silent, long-standing struggle to find a place that didn't feel like a layover. The isolation of the riverbank acted as a catalyst, a safe niche where the walls they usually kept up for survival could finally crumble. James confessed that his clumsiness and his fear of worms were often just a distraction, a way to lighten the mood because he worried so much about not being enough for her. Diep, in turn, let go of her self-imposed mandate to be the strong one, finally allowing herself to be vulnerable and protected within the circle of his arms. As the clock ticked toward the early hours of the morning, the meteor shower reached its breathtaking crescendo. The sky became a chaotic, beautiful canvas of falling light, a cosmic performance just for them. Diep felt a profound sense of safety that had nothing to do with the tent or the dying fire, and everything to do with the man beside her. She felt her eyelids growing heavy, the adrenaline of the evening giving way to a bone-deep, peaceful exhaustion. James noticed her head drooping and gently nudged her toward the small tent he had struggled so hard to erect earlier. "Get some sleep, Diep," he whispered, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head. "The stars will still be here when you close your eyes. I'll stay out a bit longer to watch the fire." But before she crawled into the sleeping bag, James caught her gaze one last time, his expression turning serious yet undeniably hopeful. It was that look that reminded her of his promise from that morning. "Don't forget," he reminded her, a spark of mystery returning to his eyes. "The meteor shower was just the opening act. I told you there was a small surprise waiting for you at sunrise. You're definitely going to want to wake up for it." Diep smiled, too tired to probe any further but feeling a flutter of anticipation in her chest, and retreated into the small shelter. As James stayed outside for a few more minutes, tending to the last of the glowing embers, he looked at the dark horizon where the sun would eventually break. He knew that the next few hours would change the trajectory of their story forever. The river flowed on, a silent silver witness to a night where two souls finally stopped running from the ghost of temporary and started simply being. The niche they had carved out for themselves tonight wasn't just a place on a map. It was a promise that they were exactly where they were supposed to be.
Áp lực công ty